are talking Slayers, and this one is directed and co-written by Kevin Ashner Levin and stars one-time Punisher Thomas Jane as well as Abigail Breslin and Malin Eckerman. Now, this tries to do for vampires what Zombieland did for zombies. It tells a story of 4 social media influencers, all of whom are quite big in their respective field. We've got, an Instagrammer, we've got a YouTuber, we've got like a Twitch streamer kind of type thing. And they're actually kind of a group of loosely affiliated people called the Stream Team. And they are contacted by the head of a large tech company who wants to propose some type of mutually beneficial arrangement. Now, they're all excited about it because they're seeing a big payday and such like this. But it might be a little bit of a sinister kind of turn of events here, because unknown to them, the head of this tech company is actually a centuries-old vampire. And in this world, vampires have existed for a long time, working behind the scenes. In actual fact, many people of historical significance have been vampires, and of course their goal at the end of it is to get humans to drink the blood from. Now, along the way to this kind of tech company, they run across this character played by Thomas Jane, who is like a grizzled vampire hunter, and he kind of warns them, and of course they ignore him. But as you'd expect with a movie like this, they are of course would live to regret that decision, as they do discover there are indeed vampires and who have a malicious intent. So let's talk about what I think works for this movie. Now, this movie is one of these films that are kind of in the modern horror kind of resurgence, so to speak, that are really focusing on technology as part of their kind of storytelling. I've mentioned it a couple of times before. Modern technology being incorporated in a big part of these kind of like newer horror stories, because we didn't have things like Twitch streamers and influencers and things like that even a few years ago, to be honest with you, in any kind of great capacity. So these kind of like bounding technology are being incorporated into our kind of our media now, and it's allowing kind of filmmakers to make stories that maybe weren't we couldn't have done a few years ago, because these things simply didn't exist. And I've mentioned it a few times where we have this kind of wave of horror that's incorporating technology and elements of the kind of the modern world and the kind of the way the kind of culture is trending and incorporating technology into making these kind of new horror stories. This is one of these films where I feel that is trying to do that. So it does end up having this kind of very, very modern feel to it, in the fact that it is incorporating things that are popular, certainly with younger audiences these days. And in fact, I would say this movie seems to be aiming for certainly that kind of younger audience, the kind of people that would enjoy watching people game online and Instagrammers and things like this. I'm not saying there's older people that like that, but that's obviously the kind of the target demographic here. The interesting thing with this movie is it kind of tries to incorporate those elements and incorporating them into characters within the movie and celebrating them, but at the same time kind of taking pot shots to these kind of like pop-up internet celebrities that we kind of have these days. So it almost wants to have its cake and eat it too, in regards to making any sort of commentary on the modern kind of like internet celebrity. So I found that kind of quite interesting, and it also tries to, this is where the kind of the comparisons with Zombieland that comes in, and obviously Abigail Breslin was actually in Zombieland, so it's definitely, I would say it was a definite choice here. We have, for example, in Zombieland, you had the zombie kill of the week, and it had these little cutaways and things like that. This movie does a very, very similar thing, having these kind of like either cutaway scenes or kind of funny kind of like sound effects or graphics or overlays and things like that, to try and give it this kind of very kind of like pop culture-y kind of feel to it, a modern kind of feel to it. But it's certainly, I would say, even more so than Zombieland, incorporating elements of the kind of the technology as well with it. So I feel this movie is certainly aiming for a younger audience. Audience is a bit more familiar with the likes of your TikTokers, your Instagram models, and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, it's kind of certainly aiming for those audiences who would maybe want to watch this film more so than other people. But it does mean that this movie is quite kind of fast-paced, and it has these kind of these very kind of flashy kind of overlays, and it makes it look like it's kind of quite have a lot of like pomp and kind of like circumstance and these kind of you know, flashy kind of elements to it that kind of will distract from some of the other elements that we'll talk about in a minute. It's a fairly fast-paced movie. It's not long really before the kind of the jig is up. We have these kind of vampire attacks and things like that, and it does incorporate elements of, I would say, traditional vampire lore. You know, vampires have been behind the scenes for a long time in this movie, and they've kind of built up wealth and kind of influence and power and things like that. And you know, that's all kind of incorporated as well. So it's kind of like a mixing of vampire lore with old and new. I actually kind of quite liked our grizzled, you know, salt of the earth type kind of vampire slayer here, played by Thomas Jane. He was a little bit, you know, it took a little bit of time to warm to him, to be honest, because he just seems a little bit too much of a caricature to begin with. But I have to say, after a little while, you know, I quite liked his character, and I think Thomas Jane kind of goes all in on the physicalities here, really looking like a hobo, I have to say, and I think they did a quite a good job of really making you feel like this man is, you know, it's the edge of sanity in regards to his presence of mind and things like that. And that's kind of all I'll say about the positives of the movie, because I have to say this movie I think could appeal to certainly a younger audience, people who are interested in, as I said, the aforementioned social media to this big degree. But you take all that kind of flash off, and it's really somewhat of a generic kind of low budget kind of vampire film. Let's break it down a little bit more in regards to some elements here that I wasn't so keen on. So the characters and the cast. The cast primarily is these four influencers. Now, Abigail Breslin, as I've mentioned, is one of them. She's kind of written out the story relatively quickly because she's a named actress. As with Malin Eckerman, she's not there all that much. Thomas Jane shows up a little more, but the other two kind of, I would say, more famous actresses, you know, there's reasons why they're not on the screen for all that long. But I think one of the kind of the key elements of this movie is these four influencers. They are clearly trying to appeal to this young audience by having all these kind of people be these faux kind of like internet celebrities to kind of have that connection to what people are enjoying these days. But at the same time, they're taking kind of pot shots at that kind of lifestyle as well, and therefore it makes them a little bit unlikable, makes them kind of quite vapid. And that might well be a realistic kind of portrayal of how a lot of these people are like. But ultimately, when you're kind of watching this as our sort of four protagonistic people, our characters, it kind of makes them hard to root for. Even our kind of our main kind of protagonist, our main character to a certain degree, this Twitch kind of streamer girl who's like the slightly kind of goth one who is like, I can't be bothered with anything. And she's a bit more suspicious. Even she comes across as somewhat kind of prickly, unlikable. So we have these kind of four characters that are somewhat unlikable. You know, Thomas Jane's character as well. I kind of ended up liking his character as the film went on, but it takes a while because it just feels a little bit too like written to be this kind of grouchy, kind of typical old grouchy kind of character who is a bit of a blowhard, etc., etc., with some kind of cheesy kind of like you know, voiceovers and things like that, which I don't think particularly really helped. So we have somewhat unlikable kind of characters. The acting is a mixed bag, I would say. I don't think it's terrible necessarily, but it kind of feels like acting. You know, this is the best way to describe it. You know, you're not going to go into this movie and believe these characters are really these characters. It kind of seems kind of like, you know, tongue-in-cheek, so to speak, to be fair, but, you know, you're not ever really going to believe these characters are ones you can kind of really feel for and root behind, because the acting is a little broad from pretty much everyone, to be honest with you. The story itself is kind of relatively kind of basic, and when you strip out all the flashy elements to it, all the kind of the overlays, the graphics and things like that, you know, you feel like it's really kind of somewhat ripping off Zombieland's aesthetic, but it's really it can't afford to have much other than these kind of flashy overlays. It does feel quite low budget and kind of quite cheap and nasty at times. The vampire effects, I would say, are not brilliant, to be honest. It comes across as super kind of cheesy at times, and you know, the characters are played so broadly. You just think, oh, these characters are so dumb and kind of like not realistic in some degree. I mean, it's somewhat of a hyper reality, so you can't really complain too much about, you know, Oscar-worthy acting, I suppose. But you know, it just feels like these characters you're not too keen on. You're not really caring about it. They're making kind of dumb decisions. The whole plot is really quite generic, to be honest, and taking elements from kind of other sort of previous properties, and it's very much somewhat formulaic at the end of the day. It kind of feels like this movie is just trying too hard, to be honest. It's trying to be too hard to be the next Zombieland, and it doesn't quite match up, and ultimately looks like a power imitation, unfortunately. So it's not particularly I think original. I think the characters are quite unlikable, and I think the kind of the flashy visuals, the kind of like the editing, which is very kind of quick at times. You know, you feel like you're watching essentially an hour and a half long TikTok video. So does that sound appealing to you? Because that's ultimately kind of where this movie is, you know, falls. It kind of feels like it's made for this younger audience, by maybe people who don't quite understand the appeal of it, and are trying to emulate that look. But I feel older people might be put off by the headache-inducing kind of like visuals and editing and flashing lights and things like that, and maybe some younger people will get you know, interested in it. But to me, it was kind of a little bit too flashback without any kind of real substance. But I appreciate the attempt to have a little bit more of a you know, a modern kind of horror filming that incorporates these elements that I feel are part of society now and are part of certainly people's you know, lives, no matter if you like it or not. So I'll give it a 4 out of 10. I think it was an okay attempt, but I do think it failed on some levels. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.